It's been 28 years since The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past hit store shelves. It was only the third game in a now monolithic franchise. It is 7 years older than I am. It introduced series staples like the hookshot and empty bottle, yet despite how long it's been, it remains one of the most refined games in Nintendo's library. About the only thing you hear about it in negative terms is that it streamlines its main progression, and even that seems to be a relatively fringe opinion. Much like Ocarina of Time, it passed me by until my adulthood. I had only watched a few Let's Plays, passively enough that my first playthrough at the beginning of this year was still mostly fresh. As such, I'm in a fairly unique position to examine it with that perspective. The perspective of someone who has played every other Zelda game that came after, who wasn't there for the zeitgeist. I'm not exactly interested in being fair, and I really never have been. I have a lot of respect for what A Link to the Past has done and how much it means to the series as a whole, but I also think that for it to truly be considered a masterpiece, it has to stand on its own merits even in the face of its own future, and I recognize that may be a tall order. This series has always been relative though. To truly pick out which ideas thrive and which don't, I need to pit every Zelda game together to reach that answer for myself. If you aren't interested in that perspective, there are hundreds of other videos that likely say everything you want to hear. I'm interested in one question. Does A Link to the Past hold up 28 years after its release? I was watching a Game Maker's Toolkit episode on Halo 3 ODST, as one tends to do with their Saturday evening. In it, he brought to my attention a quote from Miyamoto explaining why A Link to the Past had a more linear structure than the original, one that I was unaware of prior to watching his video. I could just quote Miyamoto directly, but Mark was also the one who brought it to my attention in the first place, so it felt wrong to just ignore that part of it. To paraphrase, it was done to keep the storyline coherent. If the player had too much choice, it would be a programming nightmare for the narrative to stay consistent. There would be way too many branching paths to keep track of. In other words, A Link to the Past's restrictive nature was Nintendo's admittance that there was a brick wall in the way to progress. They wanted to make The Legend of Zelda a series where you explore to your heart's content, but they also wanted to make it a series of epic legends. One side of that coin would eventually become Breath of the Wild, freedom personified. The other side would eventually become Twilight Princess, the epic personified. Breath of the Wild had to sacrifice the quality of its story in order to remain free, while Twilight Princess had to sacrifice its freedom to keep the adventure coherent. It's clear that this wall dividing the two strengths of Zelda still exists today, and it is a damn tough wall to crack. A Link to the Past, I'd argue, lands somewhere in the odd middle. It does not have a particularly epic or even entertaining story, but it's a story that functions. The opening is eye-catching. The rainstorm and accompanying music instill a sense of urgency in the player. Your drive to action is the murder of your uncle, who asks you to save Zelda, and in so doing, free Hyrule from the inevitable clutches of the evil Ganon. Again, this is definitely a story, one that allows the player to step into the shoes of Link, a purpose his character has and will likely always serve. However, the shoes you step into are not well defined. In Twilight Princess, you were still stepping into the shoes of Link, but you had a better idea as to whose shoes those were. You spent time working on the farm, you bonded with the villagers, and you built this image in your mind about what story you'd be working within the confines of. You're not just Link, resident adventurer. You're Link, slayer of Zant, ally to the Twilight, and the aptly dubbed hero of Twilight. As counterintuitive as this might sound, the fact that Link already has a backstory gives you more relatable shoes to step into than if he was a blank slate, like he is in Breath of the Wild. It really is a shame that this comes at the cost of a strictly linear structure though, because Breath of the Wild allows the player a heightened sense of self-expression. A Link to the Past allows you to step into a pair of shoes that are vaguely defined. You are the last in a line of holy knights that defended Hyrule in years past. Your goal is the mystical Triforce that you can use to restore the Golden Land and stop Ganon's evil from spreading. The Dark World is a fascinating location, overrun by dangerous monsters, a frightening mirror image of the peaceful Hyrule. It's also worth noting that this was the first Zelda game to successfully incorporate NPCs into a somewhat believable world. I enjoy exploring Kakariko Village and learning information about Hyrule and the various secrets lying in wait. Whether it be the vanishing boy with the ocarina, the whispers of treasure at the Waterfall of Wishing, the stranded blacksmith in the Dark World, the silent locksmith next to the desert, the thief that warns you of their old master Blind, who just so happens to be the deceptive boss of Thieves Town. It takes one of my favorite elements of the original Zelda, improves the translation so that all the clues make sense, and places them within a less archaic game. For the most part, these shoes are still just shoes, but you're allowed to explore the well-realized world it sets up all the same. It is frustrating, though, that the main story is still just as generic as it used to be, an evil wizard resurrecting Ganon that Link must then stop. At this point, it's still as rudimentary as a traditional Mario story. While you have a lot of freedom to explore a fleshed-out Hyrule, I wouldn't say it marries player-driven and game-defined storytelling. Rather, it forms a compromise between them, a backstory to better identify with your role in the world, but nothing more, as the limited freedom already present prevents the story from having additional layers. It is a technically motivated compromise, but a compromise nonetheless. This is where we get elements like the linear dungeon progression. Even if it is a clear departure from the first Zelda's design goals, there's still a decent degree of freedom once you reach the Dark World. While you can't access every dungeon at once, there are a few that can be opened out of order. After obtaining the magic hammer in the first dungeon, you can travel to the second, third, or fourth dungeon. If you do the fourth, you can then do the fifth right after. If you do the fourth in the second, you can do the fifth or sixth afterward. I'm not going to go over them all in excruciating detail. My point here is this. There are no story triggers halting progression. Instead, there are item triggers. So while there are only a few opportunities to do dungeons out of order, similar to Ocarina of Time, there is at least a chance for you to explore some dungeons in a different order each time. While later dungeons are more difficult, some enemies even doing 3 or 4 hearts of damage in a single attack, because you're given a clear order on the map screen, it's justified to encounter more difficulty when stumbling into a dungeon that should be tackled later. Although this transparent showing of which order the dungeons should be completed in is strange. If the developers really wanted the story to make sense, why is the player still able to do many of the dungeons out of order? The story messages you get at the end of each dungeon feel like they can be experienced in any order. The only one that should probably be read last is in Turtle Rock, which you don't even have to read last because the Ice Palace has an optional item in it. The only reason you need to complete the Ice Palace is simply because it's required. There really is no reason that the dungeons needed to be this linear. That excuse only really works in the beginning of the game, where characters have specific text that triggers before and after dungeons. Zelda 1 did technically have limits, since some dungeons could only be completed when you had a specific dungeon item. Since the game didn't tell you where to go, however, these limits are easier to forgive. There's a certain amount of immersion lost when the game is so overtly telling you where to go in such an unnatural way. Zelda 1 numbered its dungeons too, but that was only upon discovering one. The magic of it all was the act of discovering each dungeon. You burned a bush and found level 8. You solved the Lost Woods puzzle and found level 6. That way, you had a better idea as to when you were getting yourself into something more challenging than you were supposed to, without the game needing to spoil that order to you from the get-go. Though they may have often been in broken English, the first Zelda gave you vague hints through its NPCs about where you should go next. A Link to the Past opts to force you into knowing where to go at all times, instead asking you to find hidden dungeon items required to progress that are alluded to by NPCs. You eventually require the Ice Rod during Turtle Rock that is hidden east of Lake Hylia. You also require the Zora Flippers at the Waterfall of Wishing, and need to grab the Moon Pearl within the Tower of Hera. By the point at which these items are required, you would have probably already explored the world thoroughly enough to have gotten your hands on them. This does not happen frequently enough, however, and what this results in is a story that feels uneventful, and a world that feels stagnant. You're just kinda aimlessly wandering from dungeon to dungeon. I get that this is sufficient for most people, especially since Breath of the Wild took a similar backseat to its story presentation, and no one but me really seems that bothered by it. I think this works better in Breath of the Wild because the only thing required of you is to defeat Ganon. In A Link to the Past, you must do every dungeon no matter what. That is still required of you even though it doesn't affect the story much at all. It was also required in the original Zelda, but that game also had several required items hidden throughout the overworld, in addition to its hidden dungeons. Some of them may have gone a little too far. I have no idea how the hell you're supposed to figure out what this meat does, but I do enjoy it in concept far more than the approach taken by A Link to the Past. Look at a game like Link's Awakening or Twilight Princess. They had a linear dungeon order, for the most part anyway, but at least I can understand why. You had interactions with Marin and the townsfolk, building those relationships for that downer of an ending to pack more of a punch. A rivalry formed between Link and King Bulblin. A bond formed between Link and the Hyrule Resistance. A growing companionship formed between Link and Midna, all culminating in an epic climax to pull it all together. Compare that to A Link to the Past, where the only consistent dialogue you have with someone is through Sahasrahla telepathically communicating you tutorial tips. You have a brief back and forth with Aghanim, but it's hard to get invested in his character when Zant and Girahim both serve as puppets for Ganon far better. One, the unfortunate puppet that manages to redeem himself, and the other, a flamboyant servant to the bitter end that you clash with a multitude of times. You only have 2 battles with Aghanim, and the second one is only different because he spawns clones of himself. He is literally a plot device. Now, I get that it's hard to tell stories on the Super Nintendo, but if they were already willing to streamline progression this much, it puzzles me why they didn't go the extra mile like they eventually would in Ocarina. I have my own problems with Ocarina of Time, and may have even said in the past that I don't find the story very impressive. As I've had time to reflect, however, Ocarina's narrative is a thematically rich and meaningful coming-of-age story that's able to tell a large part of it through its gameplay. The time travel, though mechanically underdeveloped, had a narrative purpose. A Link to the Past, by comparison, lacks that same nuance and complexity. It strikes a compromise between player-driven and game-defined exploration that feels void of meaning, as it fails to inherit the strengths of either approach. Now, this is all said with the acknowledgement that this is still farther than most entries in the series are willing to go. Most of the games that came after it follow a rigid dungeon order, even the games that claim to be more open-ended. Outside of a few dungeons in Ocarina, we wouldn't return to any semblance of a non-linear format until A Link Between Worlds. It's why I still appreciate the freedom in A Link to the Past, even if it could have been handled better. I sometimes like to acquire the Blue Mail in the Ice Palace as soon as possible to get a quick defense boost and make Mothra in particular an easier time. I sometimes like to skip the Blue Mail entirely if I want a more difficult playthrough. Since you can quite easily get 3 to 4 bottles and stock up on potions and fairies, face tanking can be quite common if you know what you're doing, so it helps to have somewhat of an imposed challenge option. That's probably what I love most about this game. You can organically set your own difficulty by exploring. As previously established, you can do several dungeons out of order, and later dungeon enemies will do more hearts of damage to you, giving potions and fairies more use. This sense of danger is enough to elevate the otherwise simple combat, and get you thinking about what items you can use to better defeat the enemies sent your way. You get access to a fire rod, an ice rod, 3 screen nukes, a magic invincibility cape, and the standard Zelda set. Fighting enemies has never been more fun thanks to your expanded arsenal. The way these items are tethered to the magic meter sets up interesting combat scenarios. Should you, for instance, use your ice or fire rods against enemies that are weak to them and waste your precious magic, or should you stock up on magic potions to ensure you'll never run out? Any space you're taking with a magic potion can't be used for fairies or health though, and the only option that restores both magic and health is expensive in a game that often takes your rupees. So should you spam screen nukes and magic items willy-nilly, or get in with your sword? Many of your magic attacks are defensive in nature, allowing you to either avoid damage or attack at range where damage in close quarters can be avoided. Sword combat is as simple as you circling away from enemy attacks. Nothing special inherently, but this trade-off with the magic meter, the aggression of the enemy AI, and the staggering power they can sometimes wield makes up for the relative simplicity of said combat. I find myself struggling more than most Zelda games even when I'm not limiting myself, and can only imagine what a challenge run would do for the game's difficulty. It also helps that this game's combat control is incredibly well done. Giving Link a horizontal forward slash sounds like a minor change, but it is a significant step forward. One of my least favorite aspects of the original is the combat. Often my deaths would feel cheap because my line of attack was so limited. 4 short stabs in the cardinal directions, plus some other dungeon items that could also only attack in the 4 cardinal directions. Movement was real funky. Sometimes Link would find himself out of alignment with the specified turning angles, which would then move him over so that he could properly turn. This is very hard to describe, but if you've played the game, you'll know what I mean. Link isn't limited in his 4-directional movement, and that makes precise turning a huge pain in the ass. Give Link the ability to move freely and give his sword more range, you've practically solved the entire problem. Now it doesn't feel cheap to run into a room and encounter a million different projectiles, obstacles, and enemies. In the original, I sometimes wanted to break my controller, since Link didn't feel properly equipped to deal with the barrage of threats thrown his way on a regular basis. A Link to the Past afforded me that confidence, even if I did still get my ass handed to me on occasion. The important part is that I didn't feel cheated, I felt bested. Speaking of combat, the dungeons certainly feel enemy and trap heavy, more so than previous games, but I find that they don't tend to settle on one or the other. Skullwood sees you entering the dungeon from different points through the overworld. Thieves' Town is a surprisingly open dungeon that sees you escorting a hostage that is disguised as a boss. The Ice Palace is a tiered labyrinth of ice-related challenges, backloaded by a devious puzzle. Turtle Rock is a series of traps and challenges meant to catch you off guard. Ganon's Tower is incredibly long, challenging, and uncomfortable, befitting of the final stretch. These dungeons may have a puzzle focus or a combat focus, but in the end, you'll find that each dungeon is a unique mixture of both approaches. Some dungeons have rooms that only exist as traps, some lock you in and have you find a switch to escape, some eat your keys and force you to find another, some make you redo a section of the dungeon. Pair this with the added challenge that seems to accompany the 2D Zelda titles, and you've got a set of dungeons that are very tense, in the good way. It has one of the most consistent set of bosses I've ever seen. Mothra is a test of avoidance, asking the player to weave in and out of obstacles on a conveyor belt. Vitreous feels like a game of Breakout, where you have to hit the bouncing eyeballs and dodge his electricity. Blind the Thief is similar, though I'd argue his heads are much easier to avoid. Generally, the reason these bosses are good is not necessarily because they test different skills, but because they all keep the player on their feet. The player needs to be on the edge of their seat the entire fight as they're bombarded with projectiles or other attacks, culminating in the big bad final Ganon fight. I can't really even say there's a dungeon I dislike in this game. The first 3 dungeons are a little simpler than I'd like, but the Dark World dungeons are sufficiently challenging to navigate. That's the thing though. They are sufficient, not standout. I struggle to also pick a favorite dungeon among this list. Most of the dungeons in Oracle of Ages reach beyond in terms of confusing progression and puzzle solving, while most of the dungeons in Oracle of Seasons reach beyond in terms of combat and action. Most of the dungeons in the rest of the series are more visually interesting or memorable, and they all have unique music tracks to set a distinct atmosphere. A Link to the Past only has one. The Swamp Palace, for instance, is pretty straightforward. There aren't many misdirects, it's mostly focused on room-to-room puzzle solving. A Link to the Past is more difficult than other Zelda games, so this structure works more to its benefit, but it doesn't change the fact that the dungeon is pretty boring to navigate. All you're ever asked to do is lower the water level a few times. A far cry from Jabu Jabu's belly or the Water Temple. Thieves' Town is similarly simple. At first it seems hard to navigate, but that's really just a placebo. You'll be lost for a few minutes at most until you get out of these 4 open rooms and enter the linear second half. There are obstacles and enemies along the way that challenge you in their own way, but even these get repetitive near the end of the game when it feels like they're piling projectiles and annoying enemy types on top of you back to back. Winders, Beamos, Medusas, Rabbit Beams, they're strategically placed within normal fights to artificially inflate their difficulty, especially transparent in the later dungeons where enemies do even more damage out of nowhere. Dungeon progression is more tense as a result, but sometimes it's handled less than naturally. Without that difficulty, dungeons like Turtle Rock would and kinda do feel a little dull to navigate. It almost tries to goad you into wasting all of your magic power so that you can't defeat the boss at the end. Though it is helped somewhat by a random hint by Sahasrahla informing you about the medicine of magic. It masks the fact that all you do in Turtle Rock is enter and leave a bunch of random rooms for seemingly no reason. It has nothing on the Turtle Rock in Link's Awakening, that's for sure. The Ice Palace only really feels as difficult as it is due to the ice physics mixing horribly with the moving traps and enemies. Anytime you're on solid ground, it feels more reasonable, but still pretty linear. It's fun to figure out this block puzzle at the end, since it requires that you find an alternate path around the entire dungeon after hitting one switch, but the lead up to that moment feels unfocused, and if you have the Cane of Somaria, you can bypass that puzzle altogether. I spent a majority of my playthrough away from all this, though. What I was most interested in was the overworld, both the light and dark renditions of it. It may fail to serve a narrative purpose, but it makes up for that by developing it as a tool in your arsenal. Ocarina's time travel primarily served a narrative purpose, and often neglected any fun mechanical uses you could get out of it. Sure, you use it for the Spirit Temple in the bottom of the well, but then you're basically done. It has nothing on the Oracle of Ages time travel, that's for sure. This might have something to do with how time travel is initiated. Since you're forced back to the Temple of Time whenever you want to time travel, asking the player to do it too much would get tiring very quickly. It has some really good ideas, but it feels like a downgrade compared to the Dark World. As previously mentioned, the Dark World is a mirror image of Hyrule. An alternate future should Ganon invade. It used to be the Golden Land, long tainted by evil influence. Exploring both locations at once is exciting. You not only get to explore one new land, you get to explore an opposite version of it that likes to screw with you. Previously friendly locations are now hostile. Your home is now a shop, Hyrule Castle is a pyramid. Things are eerily similar, but fundamentally different. It achieves the same effect as Ocarina's time travel. You get to see a relatively peaceful world with evil brewing in the background, but are then shown what that evil has wrought somewhere along the way. You now know what you have to prevent, the cruel future that awaits Hyrule. It's a great piece of world building that also functions as a traversal mechanic. The first time you travel in the Dark World, you notice a piece of terrain is missing. If you stand there and use the magic mirror, you'll be back in the Light World, atop a precipice that was previously inaccessible. This trick is used several times throughout the world. You'll be tasked with finding a Dark World portal somewhere in the world, usually well hidden. Then you use the magic mirror to get up to a ledge or sneak into an inaccessible room. I love how it isn't a simple A to B. You've got to do some lateral thinking about how you'll get to your next objective. Overall, though, I do think it's a lot easier than Zelda 1, and some of its secrets aren't as satisfying to figure out. Zelda 1 had 2 mazes, one of which only had a vague hint. It had peculiar bushes and rock walls to destroy. It had a hidden fast travel system once you obtained the Power Bracelet, which itself was hidden under an Armos. A Link to the Past won't ask you to do anything too extreme or out of the ordinary. It's usually in line with a Metroidvania-style lock system, where obtaining a dungeon item will tell you what secrets you can now unlock. In that sense, I think it's a step back, but since everything else is more streamlined, I can't hate the game for it. Playing Zelda 1 was a beautiful experience when I was just exploring, but anytime I had to focus on something else, like the combat, it turned into a dumpster fire. A large part of that original game is combat, especially inside dungeons. Though the dungeons had complex layouts that were hard to figure out, they also had incredibly annoying enemies that saw me returning back to the beginning of the dungeon over and over again. It didn't feel like a challenge I could overcome, it felt like a challenge I had to leave and find a potion for. Even then, I'd still argue that the Oracle games pushed this dimension time travel mechanic way farther than A Link to the Past does with its Dark World. Oracle of Ages had an entire dungeon centered around time travel, and figuring out that you had to time travel was a large part of that puzzle. They built the same dungeon twice to account for the past and the present. Oracle of Seasons had 4 different seasons to choose from that fundamentally changed the world each time. I just keep coming back to this idea. A Link to the Past strikes a sufficient balance, but not a standout balance. I really enjoy playing it in the moment, but whenever I reflect on that experience, I realize just how many other Zelda games appeal to me personally. If I want puzzling dungeons, I'd go to Oracle of Ages. If I wanted challenging dungeons, I'd go to Oracle of Seasons. If I wanted a meaningful story, I'd go to Link's Awakening or Twilight Princess. If I wanted more freedom, I'd go to Breath of the Wild or even just A Link Between Worlds. A Link to the Past laid the foundation for the Zeldas that came after it, and I think it's weakened with time as a result. So many other games in the series have an identifiable strength. So many other games in the series have that one standout thing that keeps me coming back. The ones that don't, unfortunately, tend to be my least favorites. A Link to the Past is fun, but I can't really separate it from games like Minish Cap, Wind Waker, Skyward Sword, or Ocarina of Time. There's just nothing for me to latch onto here. And again, this is just my perspective. I always feel like I need to reiterate this, but there is not a single Zelda game I outwardly dislike. There are just some I enjoy more than others. A Link to the Past just falls short compared to future entries, which is a shame, but if you're gonna be considered a masterpiece, you're gonna have to withstand the test of time. And hey, the fact that I find the future games more appealing than this 28-year-old game means that it did its job, right? It laid a solid foundation for the other games to capitalize on. And that, if nothing else, is an impressive feat.